All right, everybody, welcome back for episode 3 of the MC Events podcast. As always, I'm Joey Capollo, joined by Gilan, and today's episode, we're going to talk about testing, what it is, why it's important, and why you should do so much of it, you're going to get sick of it. As always, I'm Joey Capollo, who is owner of Capollo Media. We do MCC highlights, the YouTube channel, as well as organize and develop block wars. So we have a little experience in analyzing and working on events. And my co-host, Gilan.
Hello, I'm Gilan. I'm a Java developer, and I work on events with Capollo Media.
So Gilan will be able to tell you from the development side what it is that testing is for. So starting off, what is testing? Testing is when you take your event or your game mode or whatever it is before it is ready and you test it. You ensure that it works as you want, or you ensure that you can find the bugs that don't work. The goal is to push your creation as far as it can go and get it. You want to get as many people as involved as possible so you can get various types of feedback and different perspectives. But to do this, that means you have to be organized, have a plan for what's going to happen during each test, and have a plan for how you're going to deal with feedback and bug reports. And those are the things we're going to get into, because that feedback, those bug reports, making the changes are the bread and butter of testing. And there's several types of testing that have different purposes.
So some types of testing, and this can depend on what your event is. It may differ from event to event. But the most basic type of test that you probably think of is like a full test, where you spend, it depends on how long your event is, but you could be spending an hours just playing through your entire event, all the games, or if it's just one game, going through one big round of it. And that's just playing it as if you are running the event with content creators or whoever your event is for, but instead you're doing it with testers. The one other type of testing that should also be done frequently is focus testing, where you focus on one aspect of it. So if you are an event that has mini games, you may decide, okay, for this test, we're only going to play this one game and we're going to do it over and over and over again. We'll just keep doing it until we find all those specific bugs. Or if you have one long test, you might just say, hey, everyone focus on the fighting, or everyone focus on loot, or like all these kinds of things. Depends on what you're doing with your event.
Mm-hmm.
And the other type would be bug hunting, which is kind of one that we kind of named ourselves. I don't know if a lot of other people have different names for it. But the purpose instead is, instead of having your players just kind of play through it as if they're in the event, play through it as if they're trying to break it.
Yes.
And like not how an actual player would be doing it, but instead like just looking for cracks in your event and trying to pull it apart.
Finding all those exploits that you didn't think you needed to code for and plan for, but could happen in an event. A good way to think about this is, imagine if in MCC's Ace Race, you tried to go backwards, or you tried to skip checkpoints. What would happen? If in Sky Battle, you tried to bridge backwards out of the map or straight down, or try to get into some spot that you weren't supposed to get into, how does the game respond to that? And so the point of bug hunting is finding all those exploits and bugs that are those fringe cases that you didn't necessarily plan for. And once you find them, you patch them, you fix them, and then you don't have to worry about it on event day for that to go wrong.
And when you brought up the example from Ace Race, the idea of going backwards or people looping back, on the surface, it's like, why would that ever happen in an event? It's like, why? No one's ever going to do that. And then you saw Space Race happen, and then you realize, oh, that's why you need to do this, because even if you're like, no person in the right mind when playing the event is going to do this, you need to be able to cover for those cases, because when it does happen, you kind of lose a bit of credibility and it kind of messes everything up.
Yeah. So what happened in a Space Race of Ace Race and MCC 14 was Philzil led a bunch of players the wrong direction, then everyone followed like ducklings crossing the street. And then they hit a previous checkpoint. And so they're like, oh, I'll just die, fall into the void, and it'll spawn me at my most recent checkpoint, like the furthest along. But instead it would spawn them at the one they just passed, which is actually going backwards in the race. And it was a case where like other racing games have had this, like a lot of the, Forzas or things like that, or Mario Kart especially, where you can't have a checkpoint triggered that's before the checkpoint you're currently on. And so that's something where you don't expect anyone to go backwards. But if something else causes players to do something unintended, now you're planning for that, ensuring that it's a quick, easy fix, or they don't even notice anything messed up.
And of course, a test is the perfect place for that to happen, because that everyone in a test knows, hey, things are going to go wrong. It's okay. We can fix them. But when you have a bunch of, for example, content creators who are trying to keep a chat engaged, who are trying to have this, presentable idea, these kinds of annoying things can really take them out of the fun of the game.
Yes. So we're going to talk more about that kind of testing as we go into feedback. But so to keep us on track, there's full tests, which is you run the event completely start to finish with everything in it. Focus test, which is you run, a game or a couple of the games, but you go, we're just trying to check if this works how you want it to work. And then bug hunting or trying to find exploits is doing, however many games you want or however long through the full event. But then you're just trying to tell players, don't play this as intended, try to break it. So those are the main three kinds of tests that you'll want to do when you're running an event. And the only way you're going to be able to have those different kinds of tests is if you are very, very, very organized.
And organization can be broken down into many things. That makes sense. It's organization. Of course we're going to do that. But the first and most important thing is have clear rules. You're going to have a bunch of people who are there to have fun and test your games. But sometimes they might have too much fun and they might do some things, and you want to keep people in line because it is a very organized thing. You want a good process. You want to take advantage of this. So make sure that both in-game and if you're using something like Discord to organize tests, you have clear rules laid out for how you want people to act, and how you want people to be respectful, and how exactly you want the environment to be, so that all the testers can have fun and there aren't disagreements.
Yeah.
The next thing is scheduling, which is another thing that Discord can be great for. You want to make sure you don't just want to ping people like, hey, come test. Like, people might not be ready. They might want to plan around certain ideas. So it's a great idea to kind of post like, hey, we want to have a test at this time. Put a timestamp that changes for time zones, because you can do that in Discord. And just say, hey, react if you're able to be there. And then you can kind of keep track of how many people you're going to have. If 3 people are there, you're like, well, we should probably change the time because no one's going to show up. So it's a great idea to kind of plan around that.
Yeah, and then plan out what you're going to do into the test so your testers know what to expect. If they're expecting to play the full event, which will take 2 hours, then make sure you say that so they can schedule themselves if they're able to do that. If instead you're saying we're testing this one game, it'll take like 20 to 30 minutes, well, then they should know that so they're prepared for that being the test they're going into. The point of having that being very communicated is that then they know what to expect when they're coming into the test and can, have a good time because they know what's coming. And then probably the most important part of then actually getting benefits out of your testing is having a feedback system. Discord's good for this if you want to set up different channels for your different games so that people give feedback about a specific game in a specific channel. But then it's set up that way so you're able to quickly get testers' feedback and then be able to decide if you're going to implement it or not. But that's just the basics of setting up organization. It can get really more complicated.
Yeah, of course. It's all up to how you want to set things up and what's going to work best for you managing the event. If you know, hey, I just want all the feedback in one channel so I can go through it and find all these things, or every time we have a test, I'm going to create a new thread and have them all type in that thread so we can close the thread once it's over, or like open up for each game and like, maybe send a message that says, okay, all feedback for this thing starts here and all those kinds of things. That's all up to how you want to run the test. And it's all to benefit the eventual changes that you're going to make to your games from that feedback.
And then when it comes time to run your first test, you've already laid the groundwork. Testers know when they're supposed to be there, which Discord channel or wherever to join to get communicated of how to join teams and such. And you're like, all right, let's do it. I would recommend, and Gilan I know would also recommend, is you do one game at a time or one round at a time. Especially if it's the first time something's being tested, play the game, play the round, and then pause if you're either pausing the actual server to be like, wait for the next game, or just pause before you start the next thing to say, testers, leave your feedback about this. Because if instead you go immediately to the next game, you're going to get a lot of feedback from the games at the later half of the test versus the first half of the test.
Yeah, and it's okay to take this time. I think in a test, you don't have to worry about it being like an event where you're trying to get people through and get people, engaged with it. You can take that time to slow down and say, okay, we're going to take a quick break between, like, okay, we only played for 10 minutes, but like we're going to take a break for a few minutes so you can all leave feedback. Testers might want to get a drink of water or something. And it's a good idea to take it slow at times. You don't want to hold them there for hours upon hours. Mm-hmm. Like, testers have lives. They want to go do things. They don't just want to play your event, even if it's really fun. But it is okay to slow things down and don't always treat tests as if they are an event.
Yes. And I think the other big thing is you want to be slow, but you want the test to keep going forward. So something like mega breaks, like your game is just not going to run and that got broken as you're trying it. It's okay to say this isn't going to work today. Thank you for finding that bug, or thank you for finding what broke this. Let's move to the next game. Obviously, testers would prefer if they got to play every game they're told they're going to play up front, but sometimes those issues happen where you're not going to play it and there's no use trying to find a solution on the spot where that solution's often just not going to work.
And another big important thing is designing your game so that it can be tested.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a certain thing where, like, okay, in an event, everything's going to move forward chronologically. We don't have to worry about resetting a game 10 times. Hopefully, you don't have to reset a game 10 times. But it might be worth having a quick reset system or having a quick way to change teams. Even if you're not going to end up doing it that often in an event, for the sake of testing, that can be a really slow time that testers, are just sitting around not doing anything. And if you speed that up, you can spend more time actually testing and fixing bugs.
It also keeps you safe and when the actual event happens for those cases where you need to pause or maybe quick reset the game because something broke or somebody crashed, you need to redo it. And it gives you more flexibility when making decisions for your event if you have the capacity to switch somebody off of teams, reset the game, or bring in a sub or add time back onto the clock. Having the games all be designed that way allows it for better testing and more flexibility on event day. So in this case, you've run your first test or you're currently running it and you're like, I want to get feedback about my games. You might ask yourself, how do you incorporate all the feedback? How do you know what to listen to? How do you decide what's worth making changes for? And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to give you an absolute about here's what to and not listen to. But the goal is to try to listen to all feedback. But instead of focusing on a solution that's proposed, focus on whatever issue the testers are saying is the problem.
Yeah, it's important to when you get, a tester's like, hey, this thing is broken. I think that it should be this way. It's okay to listen to when they say it should be this way, but mainly focus on that problem because a lot of times if you're the person who's designed this game, you might think of other solutions for it. So take time to break down a piece of feedback and think about what's really the core issue at play here, like from a game design standpoint, and what's like an efficient solution that can be made that'll still keep the game fun. So don't be locked into feedback, but at least listen to all of it and take it into account.
Yes. And there's also, you should set the expectations to your testers about what is good feedback. If somebody, for example, in Block Wars Hunt, it's a game that's currently out of rotation because it's like a hide and seek. Some players are the hiders, one person from each team's a seeker. You kill the hiders, they turn to seekers. Currently, that game is out of rotation. But if you were trying to give feedback on it, you said, game bad, I don't like this. While that does say there's a problem with this game, hey, it's not fun, you would prefer to get feedback that says, this game isn't a lot of fun because I just sit and wait for the seekers to find me. I don't get to play very much or do anything exciting during the game. And that's a feedback that then tells you, hey, this is the issue. And here's what I can kind of come up with to fix that. So it's about giving your testers the language that you want to hear that says, this is the problem that the testers want fixed. And you as the developer, like, here's how I'm going to try to fix that then.
Going back to our discussion of organization, organizing feedback is another big important part.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be able to take all this, if it's a one long Discord channel, you need to take all that feedback and compile it into a list of like what is actually needs to be thought about, what do we need to discuss, what needs to be changed. And you can organize this however you want. It's probably a good idea to organize like bugs versus features. Like, what's a time a player's like, hey, this thing is broken. Like, this is something that's supposed to happen and it's not happening.
Mm-hmm.
You might want to put that in a section where it's like, okay, this needs to be fixed. It's a bug and we have to fix it. But also, it's okay for testers to have ideas for what features should be added or what features should be changed. And that can be put in another section and thought about differently. You can break it down by games, this game versus that game. That's a great idea to make sure that you know where you're getting feedback from. And then there should also be a difference on what affects the scoring of the game on like points and how a player gets rewarded for what they do versus the actual fun of playing through the game and the actions and the mechanics. That's a very important distinction.
I think the big thing too is you need to be very humble when you're receiving feedback. It can be easy to say, have somebody play this game. that you've spent tons of hours on, and they say, I didn't have fun for these reasons. And you go, no, those are the reasons you're supposed to have fun. And then get into an argument that way. And you need to acknowledge that people are going to have different perspectives and enjoy different things about games. And so allowing them to give feedback that maybe you see as something you're not going to change, but then being confident to say, we're not going to change it because we want the game to play this way. But also acknowledging that their point of view is still a valid one. But you're choosing to say this is the direction the game is going.
There's also an important difference between, if you have a test with, it's like an MCC test where you have like 40 people are in the test. And out of 40 people, 3 people have a problem with something. Like, those 3 people having a problem is much less important than if 25 people had a problem with something. Because when more people have a problem, especially with a feature, that's a sign that there is a lot of people that are angry with something and don't like the way it is. And that's when it's more important to look at that. Because, of course, with every game, even if we look at something like MCC, there are content creators in MCC who hate certain games. And if they were testing those games, they would say they disagree with this game. But there's also people who like those games. And sometimes the amount that likes them outweighs those who don't. And like, it's your decision as a game designer of when do you implement something, when do you change things, and when do you stand your ground and decide, no, this is how you're just going to have to deal with it.
Those obviously aren't easy decisions to make, and you're going to have to continually make these decisions. But it's ensuring that you have a good relationship with the testers to know that they know you're listening to their feedback and that you're giving rationale for the things you do and don't implement. You don't need to give a 3-paragraph essay of why we didn't change this one little minor thing, but just say, no, we know that's a thing that you don't like, but it seems to work for everyone else fine. Having said that, there are issues that will only not work for a small number of players that should still be fixed. For example, if it's an issue that's only affecting high ping players and you're like, this issue is breaking the game for them, you should obviously fix that issue. But if it's more of an opinion, like style feedback you're getting that you're like, we want the game to be this way, it is okay to then tell that tester, hey, we like that feedback, but for this game, at least it's staying this way. So you've finished your test, you've gotten all this feedback. You now need to compile it all into a list that you're going to use for the development cycle so that especially if you're working with a team, you can assign who's working on each thing. But before that, you have a conversation about all of the feedback you've got and then make the action items that should be changed.
Yeah, and when as a person who has to, on many teams, I'm the person who has to take that feedback and implement it. It's important for me to, even once I get an organized list, to figure out, okay, what should I work on first? What's most important? It's like a lot of times I fix bugs first, especially like smaller ones that I know I can do pretty quickly and just kind of get those out of the way. I try to fix those because that can actually break the game and it's maybe hurting a lot of the testers' ability to play. And then when I have, a very broad feature idea, I might have to set aside more time to think through the problem and how I'm going to fix it. So planning that all out, just like anything else in life, you need to just take time to plan out how you're going to implement all this feedback.
And then be communicative with your testers when you go, all right, we're going to the next test. Here's what we've changed from the previous one, incorporating your feedback. Here's what's kind of potentially on the docket to change if there are things, or saying, no, this is kind of where we're at with it. Give us new feedback for this cycle, this round of doing the tests. The other thing that's important is if testers are giving the same feedback about a game every time they play it, particularly if it's several of them, like enough that you're like, this seems to be an issue, then don't just keep playing the game without ever fixing that issue, because they're going to say, hey, why isn't this a thing yet? There can be cases, though, that the thing they're asking for isn't possible. For example, in Block Wars of Tridents, which is part of Move, you get a trident through the water. And even if you have night vision on, even if you have water breathing or dolphin's grace or any of the things, the water is still hard to see through just because of how Minecraft works. And you can't change that setting with any methods. And so even though there's lots of feedback, hey, change this thing, you would just tell them as a developer, this is literally unchangeable.
Yeah, that's where we come back to the limits of Minecraft as a game. There's a certain point where we're very limited. Now, there's ways to work around things. Like a good example is with MCC Ace Race. They're able to fix tridents so that you wouldn't collide anymore when you were using Riptide tridents. But the trade-off was how tridents work. They feel a bit different on MCC. They work differently. And people get used to it, but it's like there's always these kind of trade-offs for how well you can make a game. The perfect game does not exist. You just have to figure out what elements do you care most about?
And that's when you go back to those design pillars that you have for your game, as we talked about in the last episode. So ensuring that your game has an identity and you make your changes fit based on that identity that you want to have. So you may have done all that. You ran your tests, but now you're like, Joey, Gilan, I don't even have testers. You're a different group being like, I don't even have this yet. How do I get testers? Obviously, the first thing you want to do is you put out an application. There's also the tester cord Discord server, which kind of consolidates a lot of the testers who test for lots of different Minecraft events, and they're usually willing to test for new ones. But you make an application, you put it out there on your Twitter, or get it to that Discord somehow, and then you have your Discord server set up for your testers that has rules, organized channels, all the roles as appropriate. But you want to make sure you have a varied player base of testers. You don't want all 40 to be as good as Man with Raft and just would place first individual in any other test. But you also don't want 40 who aren't quite sure what Minecraft is and just showed up because it sounded fun. You want to make sure there's a balance, because having that balance allows for different perspectives and people to tell you, if I place the worst of my teams, I still have fun, versus people who place the best, that they have fun. And then while it's important to get a mix of time zones, if you know that for when you're going to run tests, it's going to be the same time zone, same time range every time. So you're like 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. EST. You're like, maybe I shouldn't really get any North American testers if I try a test during the week, because a lot of them will be in school. So you're like, all right, we need to get a lot of European testers then. So ensuring that you have your testing time range matching up with the time zones of your testers, because you shouldn't expect them to miss their life obligations for it.
Yeah, and when you're setting up this application, a lot of this information you need, you can put in it. If it's a Google form of some sort, you can have people say what time zones. You can have them say what days of the week are you available. You can ask them that information. A lot of times you also ask, like, what experience do you have with testing? And that's kind of this thing that we've talked about before, where it's like when you ask someone for experience, a lot of times people put what they've tested in, and then the idea is, well, if you've tested before, then you'll probably be a great tester again. And that makes sense, because in most other jobs in the world, if you say I have experience, do you have a higher chance of getting hired or put into a position? But in terms of testing, I think there's a certain amount, again, with our idea of mixing up who you have in your test. There's a certain amount of times where someone's like, I've never really tested before. That might be a great person to put in testing, because they may not know about, MCC or other things, and are just like, well, I just heard about this, so I just want to do it. They might have a unique perspective on games and might be able to experience it in a different way and give you better feedback from a different perspective of all the people who've just tested in dozens of other events before yours.
So a way to think about this, it'd be great if you're able to have for your event all of MCC's testers. But if you had all of MCC's testers, they would have higher expectations for how well produced your event should be. And they would also give feedback that's probably very similar to the feedback they give MCC, because that's what they're used to. You want to make sure that you're having people who are experienced testers so they kind of know the process. But you want to make sure to bring in new people with fresh ideas and perspectives to make sure you're getting new ideas put forward. As well, it's something that's talked about a lot in Block Wars, is that idea of balancing full tests in particular. So when you play the full test, as we said, you're playing the full event. And when you're playing a Block Wars full test, that means 8 teams, 40 players. And the goal is you don't want one team to just dominate the other 7 teams, because you want it to kind of mimic what the event actually is with the players. But how do you kind of find the balance of testers when they haven't played yet, or haven't determined averages for everyone? And I'm going to give a hot take here, Gilan. You ready for this?
Oh no.
Balancing teams does not matter until you are like right before your first event.
Yeah, I think that's very true, because when you're a lot of testing is just making sure the game works. And a lot of that can be seen even with broken teams. You can still see if things are breaking. But the minute changes you might make right before your test, a lot of times are going to be like point balancing and like loot balancing and like slight little things here and there. It's a good idea to save that till the end. And when you are doing that, that's when you need those balanced teams. Because earlier, if you're doing these big changes, balancing the teams isn't going to help. You're not going to see these big point swings at that point. You're just going to be focusing on making sure the game's fun. But right before a test, that's when you really have to focus on, okay, how are points going to work? How is it actually going to be how are we going to decide the winner in a fair way?
It's a case of when you are testing the full event to ensure, the games work, it's fun to play, all these things, balancing doesn't matter that much. But when it comes time to test the little things, make sure that if the games are balanced, do they all play fine? Do the points they give out work? Then you should be balancing around skill levels of your teams and players. But I think it's important to not get caught up in that at the beginning, because the first bit of testing is just making sure everything works. And that is the most you're going to do. The most intense testing you're going to do is ensuring things work. And even when you're looking at focus tests or bug finding tests, often you're not looking at point balancing with those. You're just trying to see, do these mechanics work or can we break things? You don't need balanced teams for that in skill level because they're trying to do something very particular. If instead your focus test was like, does this game give out the right points based on how everyone performs? Then you want balanced teams to check the points.
Yeah, I mean, in tests that I've run, there's been times where like one team has had one less player. They might not have all their players because someone had to go, or we just like not enough people were able to show up. And when you're just trying to test if the game works, if you're just trying to test like how certain mechanics are going, it's okay to have one less player. And actually, it's probably a good idea sometimes to do that because it brings up a question: well, what if someone leaves midway through a game? Is the game still going to work? Like, it's actually sometimes a good idea to test what happens if someone's internet goes out and they're going to have to play the rest of the game with 3 players or 4 players. That's part of testing. That's part of the bug hunting.
That's a case where you want to ensure for bug hunting or testing your full event is at every stage of the event going on, what if somebody logged out here? What would that do to the game? Would it break something? And if it would break something permanently, how do we ensure it doesn't do that?
Yeah, I will tell you, for code wise, there are so many times, basically like every game that I've worked on, there's a listener for a player leaving and like how I have to manage that, because you just never know when someone's going to leave and you never know how you're going to have to deal with that. Like, are they going to get sent to the wrong server when they join back on? Are they going to be alive even though they left while falling in the void? Like, how are you going to manage that?
There was a funny kind of bug that happened in Block Wars 3 in battle. Heike Hate Me's team was being shown in the tutorial. All 5 of the red players are being set there. But Heike Hate Me had logged out and relogged as it like had picked his team. And instead of putting him in, then it put me in and put my skin there. And we're like, how did that happen? And then Maya goes, yeah, it's hard coded to put these 5 players in starting with me if there isn't somebody there. So that you ensure that if it's missing the player, it then has a backup to do. It doesn't just go
crash the whole
doesn't
server.
just crash because that player's missing. So it's a case of you can also test events with less players to ensure the game works just in general if there's 3 players on a team versus 4, because sometimes a thing might just not start because you don't have enough players and you go, why did that not start?
So the moral of the story is, for any event, if a player leaves, just replace them with Joey.
Just replace them with me. If you do that ever, just find me on Twitter or find me on Discord and ping me and say, hey, I put you in the event. I'll be like, I'm proud of you.
It's great. So many events. Joey's been so many events.
Been in so many events, never played in them. But moving on from that, when you're working with your testers, because they're going to be a big group and there's going to be a lot of them, probably more than the staff of the event, it's important to respect their opinions, give them space to air their feedback and the space to have fun and enjoy it. But also remember that it's your event and you're the one pushing it forward and doing the majority of the work to ensure it happens.
Yeah, testers are giving you their time. They are spending that. You're probably not paying that. I don't think any Minecraft testers really get paid. They're just kind of spending time playing the game. They're there because they find it fun. They find the community fun. But also the amount of time they're spending, an individual tester spending, is nowhere near the amount of time that someone who is actually working on the event is. And it's really up to you as the creator to really understand that this is your event, it is your creative vision, and that testers should respect that.
So it's important to establish, that's the expectations for them, that's the expectations for you, and how you're going to navigate that relationship together. And I mean, the easy points to list out for you to remember is listen to all tester feedback. Don't feel pressure to add all feedback, because that's just not going to be possible, because you'll have conflicting feedback at times. You'll have one tester say, I love this thing, and another tester will say, I hate this thing. If you try to listen to both, what would you do? You would break. But if there is a large number of testers that are concerned with this particular issue, that's something that probably needs fixes, probably a problem you should address. But mainly you're listening to the testers tell you the problems, but then you should find solutions that are both possible and fall in line with what you want the game to play as.
An important last idea when having testing, a lot of times you might be running 10 tests before an event, or even more. Who knows how many tests you may be running. Just focus tests and full tests. And you may have a group of testers and it's the same ones every time. And over time, they just kind of get used to the games. They know how it plays. When changes are made, they just have to adapt to those changes, but they already know the core idea and they've already learned these things. So it's a great idea to get new people in every once in a while. It could be when you get closer to actually running it, you want to see what happens if I just throw some people in who haven't seen it before. How will they react? It doesn't always have to be like, if you have a test that has 20 people in it, you don't need to throw in 20 new people, but you can at least get, a new team of new people and see how they react and how they feel and ask how they have to deal with these things. And it shows how actual, if you're running a content creator event, how content creators are going to react when they see it for the first time. Because content creators haven't gotten to play it 10 times. They're seeing it for the first time. And you do not want them to be lost and confused. You want them to be able to understand what's going on.
Yes, that's very important for any time you're doing a new event or implementing a new game. Is that the testers, once they play the event or the game for the first time, they're now different from the content creators or whoever's going to play in it blind. Because now they already have familiarity with the game and they know how it's expected to be played. So you want to make sure you keep getting that perspective of if someone's never seen this before, how is the game communicated to them about how they should play it? And then how do they actually play it once they've been told that? My idea for this, I've called it like event 0 functionally is a way to do this, where if you're planning for your release date of the event like March 31st, then you want to do like event 0 like March 25th or 20th, where event 0 is you get a full new team of people, at least one of your teams of new people, or like 5 to 10 new people who have never seen it, never tested it, and be like, we're going to toss you in, we're going to toss the testers in as well. Play this, tell me where you're confused. And then once you know where they're confused, you can, add more to your tutorial, add more to your explanations of the games, or just add more cues that they might need to have it be a little more straightforward. Because when people are playing it for the first time and there's the pressure of this is an event, I'm trying to win or I'm trying to entertain my audience as I do it, they're not going to be at full brain power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that I know in MCC viewers come on like, why is this content creator doing this? Like, that was a dumb idea. Why would they do that? And it's like, I don't think a lot of people realize like the amount of pressure that you go through when you are being actively recorded and being watched by hundreds, if not thousands of people. I mean, even when sometimes recording this podcast, the feeling of being recorded, even though it's not live, is like a different feeling. Like even just like it be recording a video of some sort. But like being in a live stream where that there's people in chat, sometimes content creators are trying to interact with the chat at the same time. They're trying to have that back and forth. And then on top of that, I'm expecting them to fully understand what's going on. That's a lot more pressure than just a tester who's just
playing.
And it can just doesn't have to think about it a lot.
Yes. And then especially if they're testing it for the 10th time, they're like, oh, I've played this 9 times before. I know how it works. So it's important to use your testers to get the perspective of the people who've played it a ton and make sure they can find all the issues and figure out how it should play, but also get testers that have not seen it as often. And that could be a way you bring in a second round of testers once it's time for your event to launch. And you use that second round, a small group of them, to be the blind participants to check, does everything make sense? So obviously there's a lot of testing that should be done. And we're going to give you a tentative kind of schedule of how you should do it. But at the end of the day, you should test it until it works and then test it a couple more times.
Mm-hmm. And of course, there's limits. Like we understand that if you have to schedule an event, if you're like MCC and you're running an event like monthly, like they can only do so much testing between events. They can only do so much changes. And of course, in a perfect world, it's like, well, try to push deadlines back until it's perfect. But like, it's understandable that you can't always do that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can just try and focus on testing as much as possible and trying to get those things fixed, the event will be better. It will be more fun for content creators.
Yeah. So let's say you're making a new event right now. You're following our podcast. You're doing all the things we're suggesting, which good on you, first of all. We respect that. Can't wait to see what you come up with. And you're like, all right, we have, let's say it's a 4-game mini game event. And you're like, our 4 games are coded. The maps are built. I feel like they work. We should test them now, right? And the only tests you've done have been like the developers just checking, the things work, quote unquote. I go, yeah, go get some testers and let's run it and let's see what happens. You would then you could start with a full test and just run it through all 4 games and the whole event and see what works. Or you can start with 1 game at a time. Either is up to you. Either works. It's fine. But you want to make sure you're giving attention to, the things that need to work for the full event, like taking you from the lobby to game 1 to game 2 to game 3 to game 4 to the finale, if that's a thing. You want to make sure all those things work, but you want to make sure each game is given its due diligence. If you have a game like Spleef, where you're like, I checked this works just with the devs, you might only need to play that 2 or 3 times, or maybe even only 3 times in like a focus test to ensure it works. But then you're still testing it every time you're running the full event. So you want to also be testing only the things that not only the things you think will break, but once you've tested something like this doesn't break, stop testing it. If in this example, you've done 3 of your games like these all work, they've worked fine the last 4 times you've run them, stop testing those and focus on the 1 game that's still broken and stop wasting testing time on the other 3 games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, of course, as you said, you can still have small tests with them when you do a full test. If you're doing full testing, going back as like a quick check, but you shouldn't be wasting testers' time working on something that's just gonna go fine. Like if you already know that the game is gonna work fine, then you don't need to just keep going over and over and over again. As we said, testers have lives. You have a life. Don't use that time efficiently.
Yes. And so if I were to give, it's hard to give numbers about how many tests do, because you should test till it works and then test a couple more. But you want to make sure you're using your time effectively. And so I would say somewhere in the ballpark of 2 to 3 full tests that go perfectly smoothly, then you're probably set to go. The other thing that's important is recognizing you shouldn't be testing a couple days before your event, probably. You should hopefully have all the changes, major changes and things you want done a week prior. Then you do what's called, you freeze the development. You say no more changes unless you are fixing something that is a testing issue that comes up. If then the next day, you're 6 days before the event, you run a full test and something absolutely breaks, the game doesn't even run. Obviously, you need to fix that first, but then you need to rerun that test to figure out what caused that issue. And you're going to have to run another full test. If instead on day 5, you fix that, day 5, you're like, all right, we're going to run another full test. It all works. 1 game kind of has a glitch. You go, okay, I'm going to fix that. And then day 4, you're like, I could run a full test or I could run just the focus test on that 4th game. I would say either works. If you run the full test, you'll probably feel more confident everything works. But you can also just run the focus test to make sure that change you implemented for game 4 works. But the point being that you need to make sure that testing the things that you've changed and not wasting time testing things you haven't changed.
Yeah, and I'm sure later in the future we'll talk about probably not in this episode, but later in the future we will talk about what you do when things do go wrong in an event and how you're going to deal with that. And I think it's, even if you test it and it had 2 or 3 times it works perfectly, you've frozen it, you're like, it's just going to be the same. Things might still go wrong because testing doesn't cover all the bases. You should always be prepared for things to go wrong and be okay with that and be ready to react. But the point of testing is it just takes that percentage down little by little by little until you get to a point where you might have, when you look at something like MCC, they go many events before having a big major problem. Like the MCC joke is what, like every 7 events? Every 7 something bad happens.
Yeah.
It's like a lot of events would wish if they could go 7 events without something bad happening.
I think everyone would.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have a later dedicated episode to like when something's on fire, what do we do, especially on the day of the event. We'll also have, I think, a long later episode, which is just like, here is a timeline for making an event that you can follow and adapt to your own needs. That will probably be, we think, helpful to then use. But the final summary you should get from this video is test again, and again, and then test some more.
Mm-hmm. and then a bit more. Just
and then a little bit more just for fun.
yeah.
Next week's episode, Gilan, what do we want to do?
I don't know. When do we get to interview someone?
Stein said he can talk to us about music.
Okay. We'll see if that might not be next week, but we can look into.
Well,
when we can
we'll
do
set up
something
an
about
interview and tell you, and we'll say, have a community post say what the next episode will be, or maybe I'll even put it on Twitter. But we'll get a guest, either like Stein or Wolfie or someone who has some expertise to share with us.
Yeah, because there's only so much we can talk about. I'm sure there's a lot of other topics we can go into, but it's fun to hear other people's opinions and ideas.
But that is it from us today. We will see you next time.